My name is Liana, and at 34 I thought I understood what family meant. For more than a decade I never missed a single annual gathering. Rain or shine, no matter the deadlines at work or the miles I had to travel. Those reunions were my anchor. They reminded me of summers by the coast, of inside jokes that survived generations, of hands that reached out without hesitation. I didn't follow the life plan my family laid out for me. They imagined I'd settle into something practical and stable by my mid-20s. Maybe teaching, maybe secretarial work, but I pursued architecture instead. I built a career brick by brick against their warnings and quiet disapproval. So I stayed close. I laughed at their jokes, tolerated their veiled comments, and showed up every single year. That's why, when I found out they had held this year's reunion without even telling me, something deep inside me cracked. It wasn't just an oversight. No one forgot. They had deliberately left me out. I sat alone that night, scrolling through photos online. There they were, smiling under the old oak tree by the water, fishing off the pier, passing around my aunt's famous lemon cake. Every cousin, every aunt, every uncle. Everyone except me. The betrayal was a quiet kind, the sort that doesn't scream. It just lodges in your chest like a shard of glass. I told myself I'd confront them, demand an explanation. But before I could, 3 months passed, and then one morning my doorbell rang. When I opened it, I saw them, my grandmother, my 2 aunts and 3 cousins, standing there smiling like nothing had happened. And that was when I realized, they hadn't come to apologize. The morning was crisp, the kind where the air smells faintly of wet earth, and I was still in my gardening gloves when I saw them pull into my driveway. My grandmother, now smaller and frielier than I remembered, stepped out first, her silver hair coiled perfectly into a bun that seemed to defy age. My Aunt Celeste followed, tall and poised as ever, with that sharp-eyed way of scanning her surroundings as though everything was subject to her evaluation. Behind her came Aunt Marjorie, softer around the edges but just as watchful. And then the cousins, Chloe, Eva and Beth, each of them hanging back a step, their smiles awkward, their eyes flicking between me and the ground as though afraid to hold my gaze. "Liana, darling," my grandmother called with a brightness that rang hollow. "What a lovely home you have." I stood frozen on the porch, heart pounding so hard I felt it in my ears. 3 months earlier I had been invisible to them. Now here they were, unannounced, speaking as if those missing weeks of silence and exclusion had never happened. "This is a surprise," I managed, my voice steady despite the swirl of anger and confusion tightening in my chest. Celeste stepped forward, her heels clicking against the stone path I'd laid myself. "We were in town for some family matters. Thought we might combine the trip with a visit to see where you've settled." The phrase "family matters" landed like a weight. It was their way of saying decisions had been made, always without me. Still, I found myself falling back on old habits. "Come inside," I said, because that's what I'd been taught to do. But as they crossed the threshold into my home, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they had come for, it had nothing to do with reconciliation, and everything to do with what they thought I could give them. They stepped into my living room like judges entering a courtroom, eyes sweeping over every surface, every detail. I could feel them taking mental inventory. My grandmother's gaze lingered on the tall wall of glass windows I'd installed to frame the garden. "Quite grand," she murmured, her voice a strange mix of approval and envy. Celeste wandered toward the kitchen, running her fingers along the bamboo countertops. "Is this sustainable wood?" she asked, her tone careful as if the compliment cost her something. Marjorie trailed behind, opening a cabinet without asking. "Top-of-the-line appliances," she remarked to no one in particular, her voice low enough to sound like a thought but loud enough for me to hear. Behind them the cousins whispered. "Look at the size of that bathroom," Chloe muttered, and Eva's reply floated back. "Italian marble, I'm sure of it." I kept my face neutral, moving into the kitchen to busy myself with the safety of small gestures. Boiling water, arranging cups, placing cookies on a tray. Years of family conditioning had taught me that brewing tea was a shield, something to occupy my hands when words felt dangerous. When I returned with the tray, they had gathered on the sectional in a half-circle, their posture oddly formal, as though rehearsed. The air was too still, too deliberate. I set the tray down. "So," I said, my voice light but edged with caution, "what brings you all the way here?" For a moment no one spoke. They glanced at each other in the way people do when there's a leader among them who hasn't yet given permission to speak. Finally, my grandmother placed her cup down with a decisive click. "Liana," she began, "we've been thinking about the future. And we believe we've found the perfect solution." Something in the way she said it made my skin prickle. Whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be small. My grandmother's voice carried that same tone she had used my entire life. The one that dressed commands as suggestions. "You know how much the family gatherings have meant to us over the years," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "The place we've always held them, the coastal house, has become difficult to maintain. Property taxes, repairs, well, you understand." I nodded slowly, my mind already racing ahead. That old house wasn't just a location. It was a repository of decades of memories, for better or worse. Its wide porch and weathered dock had been the backdrop to nearly every summer of my life. Celeste leaned forward, her bracelets clinking softly. "It's been decided that we'll have to sell it. But of course the tradition must continue." There it was, that deliberate, loaded pause that always meant they were about to shift the burden onto someone else. Marjorie's smile was thin but expectant. "Your home," she said, gesturing around her, "is even larger than the old place. Plenty of space, a beautiful yard. And Chicago is a wonderful city. We thought." I put up my hand before she could finish. "Let me guess. You want to have the reunions here?" Eva broke the tension with a bright, "Too fast, exactly." As if saying it cheerfully would make it less presumptuous. I stared at them, forcing myself to keep my voice even. "You excluded me from the last gathering, without a word, without even the chance to explain myself. And now you want to move the entire tradition into my home." The silence that followed was dense and uncomfortable. My grandmother didn't flinch. She met my gaze and said softly, "Family disagreements happen. But in the end, blood is thicker than water." The words were meant to unite us. Instead, they felt like a lock clicking shut. A reminder that in her mind, family ties were less about love and more about ownership. I let her words hang there, the weight of them pressing against my ribs. Blood is thicker than water. It sounded noble until you realized it was being used as a leash. "I need to think about it," I said, pushing myself up to refill teacups. A movement more about creating space than serving hospitality. And that's when the shift happened. I could feel it, subtle but deliberate. Compliments began to flow like they'd been holding them back for years. Celeste gestured toward the framed sketches on the wall. "Your design sense is remarkable, Liana. Truly museum-worthy." Marjorie nodded, her smile tightening at the corners. "And to think some of us doubted architecture was the right choice for you. Clearly, you've proven us wrong." It was so transparent I almost laughed. The sudden praise wasn't about me. It was about warming me up, softening the ground so their request could take root. But between the carefully worded flattery, little truths began to slip. My grandmother's investments had taken a hit. Celeste's husband had lost his position. The family business was barely staying afloat. The picture sharpened. This wasn't just about continuing tradition. This was about money. My home, my stability, my success. They were the new resource to tap into now that their old safety nets were fraying. As I listened, I realized something with chilling clarity. They weren't here to repair the relationship they had fractured. They were here because they'd calculated that I could solve a problem for them. When I looked around at their faces, carefully expectant, politely urgent, it hit me. In their minds, I wasn't family. I was an asset. And I was starting to decide just how much I was willing to be used. By early evening, the light spilling through my windows had turned gold, casting long shadows across the dining table. I'd prepared a simple lasagna. Nothing extravagant, but hearty enough to keep the conversation tethered to neutral ground. I served it using my mother's old recipe, a detail I knew they'd notice. Sure enough, Beth took a bite and said, "Tastes just like home." It was the first uncalculated warmth I'd heard all day. "I learned from the best," I replied with a small smile toward my aunts, though the gesture was more peace-offering than genuine nostalgia. For a while, the conversation danced harmlessly around cousin engagements, neighborhood happenings, and the latest antics of Chloe's children. No one mentioned the coastal house or reunions, but the request hovered between us like a shadow we were all pretending not to see. Then, as I set down coffee after dinner, my grandmother's voice sliced through the small talk. "Liana, your home truly is perfect for gatherings. Spacious, well-appointed, and welcoming." Celeste followed immediately. "You could easily host all 23 of us here." It would be more comfortable than the old place ever was. The number caught me. 23, I repeated. That includes me this time, I assume? An awkward stillness spread. My grandmother cleared her throat. About that, I think there may have been a misunderstanding regarding this year's reunion. I leaned back in my chair, my hands resting on the coffee cup to keep them steady. A misunderstanding? Kate told me you decided I was too focused on my career, that I'd outgrown family traditions. The air thickened. Kate stared down at her cup. Celeste's jaw tightened. My grandmother began. It wasn't quite that simple. But I was done swallowing half-truths. I could feel the words building in my chest, sharper and heavier than I'd ever dared to speak to them before. It wasn't quite that simple, my grandmother repeated, slipping into that calm, careful tone she always used when reshaping reality to her advantage. We thought you'd be too busy with your important projects, and it seemed kinder not to pressure you. I set my cup down slowly. That's interesting, considering I called you to confirm the dates so I could book my flight. If you truly believed I was too busy, that would have been the perfect time to talk about it. Instead, you just didn't tell me it was happening. No one moved. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock in the kitchen. Finally, Marjorie exhaled and looked at Celeste. We might as well be honest. Celeste's expression hardened, but she spoke. Some in the family felt you've changed, that you think you're better than us now. You left. You built a life without us. You chose your work over being close to family. The words landed like blows. Better than you? I said, my voice low. I've flown across the country to be at reunions. I've taken calls from hospital hallways at midnight so I could be here when someone was sick. I've endured constant criticism of my choices, and I still showed up. Kate finally looked up from her coffee. She's right, she said quietly. We excluded her and now we're asking her for something. That's not fair. Her defense caught me off guard, but my grandmother's face remained unreadable. Perhaps mistakes were made, she said, though her tone made it clear she saw them as inconveniences, not wounds. But what matters is moving forward. The family needs your support now. And there it was. No apology, no real accountability. Just a pivot back to their need. I realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a transaction. I sat there, staring at the people who had shaped so much of my life, who had taught me in their own unspoken ways that love could be conditional, that acceptance could be revoked without warning. You're asking for access to my home, I said slowly, after making it clear I wasn't welcome in yours. Celeste's lips pressed into a thin smile. We all have to make compromises for the good of the family, Liana. A strange calm came over me then, the kind that arrives when the truth is finally too obvious to ignore. I could see the outline of their strategy. Compliment, reframe the past, appeal to tradition, then lean on guilt. For years I would have bent under that weight. But now, I'd built something that didn't rely on their approval to stand. This house, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, isn't just a building. It's my sanctuary. I worked for years to create a place where I could finally breathe without judgment. You're not entitled to that simply because we share blood. Marjorie blinked, as if the idea of denying the family anything was foreign. We've always included you, Liana. No, I cut in gently. You've tolerated me. That's different. The air went still. Even Kate, who tried to defend me earlier, looked startled by the sharpness in my tone. My grandmother leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough for me to recognize the shift. This was her measuring me, recalibrating, deciding how far she could push. Well, she said at last, perhaps you need time to think about it. I do, I replied, knowing that this time the thinking would be on my terms, not theirs. Dinner that night felt like a chess match played in slow motion. Every word, every glance carried some calculated weight. The lasagna had long been cleared away, replaced by coffee and the thin clink of spoons against porcelain. They avoided the topic outright, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Small talk about Chloe's kids or the weather in their hometown was just filler. Every pause hung heavy with the question they weren't asking again. Not yet. Kate, sitting at the far end of the table, kept her eyes on her cup. She hadn't spoken much since defending me earlier, and I couldn't tell if she was trying to protect me or herself. At one point, my grandmother leaned back in her chair and said, "You've really made something of yourself here. This life you've built, it's admirable." It should have sounded like praise. Instead, it felt like a setup, as though the next sentence might be, "And now here's how you can use it for us." Celeste glanced at her watch, then at me. "We should discuss plans before we leave tomorrow. It's only fair to have clarity." I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides more than it shows. "Clarity is good," I agreed, "as long as it's mutual." Her brows knit just slightly before she smoothed her face back into polite composure. I could feel their patience thinning. They had come expecting me to fold quickly, maybe even to offer before they had to ask twice. Instead, I'd given them hesitation, questions, and a reminder that their hold on me wasn't what it used to be. For the first time, I realized this dinner wasn't just about whether I'd host a reunion. It was about whether I'd return to the role they'd written for me, or tear the script up completely. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, warm and indifferent to the tension that still lingered from the night before. I moved through my routine, coffee brewing, fruit sliced, plates laid out, aware of my guests stirring in the other rooms. One by one they drifted in. My grandmother was first, moving with the deliberate grace of someone who wants to appear unshaken. Celeste followed, crisp in a blouse that looked too formal for breakfast. Marjorie came last, her smile too practiced to be genuine. We made polite conversation over fruit and eggs, all of us pretending not to hear the unsaid words crowding the air. It was my grandmother who finally broke the facade. "Liana," she said, setting her fork down, "before we leave, we need to settle the reunion plans." I leaned against the counter, coffee mug warming my hands. "I've thought about it," I said evenly. "And I've made a decision." Every head lifted. The anticipation was so thick I could almost hear it. "This house," I continued, "isn't just a space. It's a reflection of years I spent building a life that felt true to me. Years when I came to gatherings where I wasn't respected, where my choices were belittled and still tried to belong. That stopped when you excluded me without a word. So now if you want an answer." I let the pause stretch just long enough for the weight to settle. "My boundaries matter more than your traditions. This home will not be the new family venue." The silence that followed was sharper than any argument. Celeste's jaw tightened. Marjorie's lips parted in surprise. My grandmother's face paled, though her eyes stayed locked on mine, searching for any sign I might waver. I didn't. Not this time. My grandmother's voice, when it came, was softer than I expected, but no less pointed. "Surely you don't mean that, Liana. We are your family." "Yes," I said, holding her gaze. "And that means I know exactly how you operate." Celeste's composure cracked. "After everything we've done for you." I cut her off before she could launch into the familiar litany of obligations. "What exactly have you done for me? Discouraged my career? Criticized my choices? Shut me out when I didn't fit the mold? That's not generosity. That's control." The words hung in the air like a live wire. Even Kate, who had defended me before, sat rigid, her eyes flicking between us. Marjorie leaned forward, her voice soothing as if she could repair the fracture by sheer gentleness. "No one's judging you now. We just want to come together again in a new way." I shook my head. "No, you want what I have. And you think if you wrap it in the language of family, I'll give it to you without question. But that's not happening." My grandmother's expression hardened into something I recognized from childhood. A mask of disappointment sharpened into weaponry. "If you choose to hold grudges instead of honoring family obligations, that's your choice. But it will be remembered." There it was, the threat disguised as moral high ground. I didn't flinch. "It's not a grudge. It's a boundary. Learn the difference." The silence afterward was absolute. It felt like we'd stepped past a point where the old roles could be restored. They might leave my house today, but I knew their exit wouldn't be the end of it. In fact, I had the distinct sense that the real backlash hadn't even begun yet. They left before noon, the sound of their car fading down the street like the closing of a heavy door. I stood at the window until they disappeared, my coffee cooling in my hand. The quiet that followed wasn't relief. It was something heavier, a strange mix of grief and clarity. By the next day, the ripple effect began. Messages trickled in from cousins I rarely spoke to, each one laced with the unmistakable tone of someone repeating a version of events they hadn't witnessed. "I heard you refused to help keep the family together. I can't believe you'd shut the door on everyone like that. You've really changed." That was the word they loved most. It made my boundaries sound like betrayal, my self-respect like arrogance. For years, I would have scrambled to explain myself to set the record straight. But now I simply closed my phone and set it face down. Instead, I turned toward the people who had shown up for me without condition. Friends who had been there in the late nights and lean times, who didn't measure my worth against their own expectations. That weekend, I invited them over. We cooked in my kitchen, filling the air with the smell of rosemary bread and roasting vegetables. There was no judgment, no undercurrent of competition. Just laughter and the ease of being fully seen. Somewhere between clearing plates and pouring wine, I realized the irony. In refusing to host the family reunion, I'd created something far more genuine. A gathering of people who didn't need me to play a role, who valued me as I was, not as they wanted me to be. And for the first time in months, I felt full. It came on a Tuesday night, when the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the dishwasher. My phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen in years. Adrian. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. Adrian, who had once sat with me on campus steps sketching designs in the dark. Who had loved my ambition when my family didn't. Adrian, who'd walked away after my grandmother whispered enough poison into his ear to make him doubt me. The message was short. I heard about what happened with your family. I'm sorry. I should have stood by you back then. I didn't know whether to feel vindicated or furious. Memories flooded back. The way he'd held my hand during my first big presentation, the way his voice had gone cold after that mysterious weekend visit with my grandmother. I typed and deleted a dozen replies before settling on the truth. I appreciate you saying that. It hurt, Adrian. More than you knew. His response came quickly. I know. I let other people's fears dictate my choices. I've regretted it for years. We spoke for hours that night, not as people trying to rekindle something, but as two survivors of the same quiet sabotage. He told me about the boundaries he'd since set with his own parents, how cutting their influence had been messy but necessary. I told him about the garden I was building, the friends who now filled my table, the way my home felt like mine in a way the lake house never had. When we hung up, I didn't feel longing. I felt understood. And that, I realized, was a kind of closure I hadn't known I needed. The first tradition I built came almost by accident. It was late November, and the idea of spending Thanksgiving alone felt hollow. But the thought of enduring the family's brittle politeness was worse. So I sent a few messages. To Sophia, who'd once pulled all-nighters with me over coffee and blueprints. To my colleagues from the firm who had cheered my Tokyo project. To the neighbors who had waved from their porches all summer while I worked in the garden. Bring a dish, I told them. And bring something that means home to you. That night, my dining table overflowed. Not just with food, though there was plenty, but with stories. Ravi brought a spiced lentil stew his grandmother had taught him to make in Mumbai. Claire made her mother's pecan pie from Alabama. Sophia arrived with a tray of dumplings, explaining her father had taught her the folding technique when she was 6. We ate slowly, trading memories and recipes, the air thick with the scents of cinnamon, cardamom, and rosemary. Nobody asked why I hadn't gone to see my real family. Nobody measured my worth by whether I fit a role. As the evening wound down, Sophia leaned back in her chair and said, This feels like family. Her words caught me in the chest. Because she was right. We stayed late, washing dishes in pairs, packing leftovers into mismatched containers. When the last guest left, I stood in the quiet, looking at the table now bare except for a single candle still burning. This wasn't the family I was born into. It was the one I had chosen. Built carefully, deliberately, out of trust, respect, and love. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I'd lost something. I felt like I'd finally found it. By spring, the garden had become more than a weekend project. It was my refuge. Rows of lavender swayed in the breeze. Bees hummed lazily over thyme and basil. And the soft crunch of gravel underfoot felt like a heartbeat steadying mine. One Saturday, as I was planting a cluster of butterfly bushes, Mrs. Hahn from next door wandered over with a tray of seedlings. Too many for my yard, she said, pressing them into my hands. Maybe they'll like it here. That simple gesture sparked an idea. The following weekend, I put a chalkboard sign at the end of my driveway. Community Plant Day. Come dig, come talk, come eat. By noon, there were strangers kneeling in my soil, children chasing each other between the raised beds, and the smell of fresh bread from someone's portable oven drifting through the air. Ravi showed up with his spiced tea. Claire brought jars of homemade pickles. We planted tomatoes, peppers, herbs. We laughed when the hose burst and soaked 2 teenagers who'd come just to watch. By late afternoon, my garden looked fuller, more alive. Not just with plants, but with the fingerprints of dozens of hands. Someone suggested we do it again in the summer. Another person offered to bring music next time. That night, sitting on my porch with a cup of mint tea, I realized I had stumbled into something the lake house had never truly given me. A gathering where everyone belonged without having to prove themselves. It was messy. It was loud. It was imperfect. And it was mine. I didn't need my grandmother's approval to host a gathering worth remembering. I'd created my own tradition, rooted in generosity instead of obligation. And unlike the old ones, this one would never require me to shrink to fit inside it. It didn't take long for word to travel. I hadn't posted anything about the community days, but others had: photos of laughing neighbors planting in the garden, long tables covered in food, kids with dirt-smeared cheeks holding up handfuls of herbs like trophies. One evening, while I was watering the raised beds, my phone buzzed with a message from Cousin Erin. "Saw pictures of your little events. Grandma says you're trying to replace the family reunion." I stared at the screen, the absurdity making me almost laugh. The garden wasn't about replacing anything. It was about creating something healthy in a space where I could breathe. But of course, in their minds, anything that thrived outside their control was a threat. The next day, I got a voicemail from my grandmother herself. "Liana, I'm concerned about what I'm hearing. It seems you have plenty of time to host gatherings. Yet not for your family. People will talk." There it was again, that sharp edge under the velvet. Not curiosity. Not even real concern. Just a warning wrapped in the language of propriety. I deleted the voicemail without calling back. The truth was, I didn't owe them an explanation. I'd spent too many years justifying every choice, every absence, every decision that didn't align with their blueprint for my life. These gatherings weren't about them at all. They were about building something that fed me instead of draining me. Still, I knew the whispers would grow. And a part of me suspected it was only a matter of time before they tried to step into this space too. Because if history had taught me anything, it was that they couldn't resist inserting themselves where they saw value. The difference now? I was ready for them. It started small, too small to be coincidence. At the next community day, I noticed a familiar figure standing at the edge of the crowd. Celeste. She wasn't dressed for gardening. White linen pants, spotless wedges. But her eyes were scanning the scene like she was assessing a property for sale. When she caught my gaze, she lifted a hand in a polite, almost reluctant wave. "I was in the neighborhood," she said when I walked over, her tone casual but her expression calculating. "Thought I'd see what all the fuss was about." Fuss. That was one way to put it. She stayed for exactly 20 minutes, not touching a shovel or accepting a plate of food, just making small talk with a few people and looking around like she was taking mental notes. Then, as she left, she said something that told me everything I needed to know. "You've built quite a network here, Liana. Impressive. Could be useful for future family plans." Future family plans. There it was, the slow reach of the same hands that had tried to claim my home for their purposes. By the following week, I'd heard from Marjorie too. A breezy text: "We should collaborate sometime. Maybe combine our gatherings with yours. Kill two birds with one stone." I didn't reply. It was clear they weren't interested in the spirit of what I'd created. They saw the crowd, the resources, the goodwill, and wanted to harness it for themselves. But this garden, these events, this community, they weren't built on the currency of obligation. They were rooted in trust. And I wasn't about to let them trample that soil just because they'd finally realized something was growing here that they couldn't control. The next community day was already on the calendar, and I knew the family might try to appear again, this time in greater numbers. I decided I wouldn't be caught off guard. 2 days before the event, I gathered a few of the regulars in my kitchen: Sophia, Ravi, Claire, and Mrs. Hahn. I told them about the messages, the visits, the not-so-subtle hints that my relatives wanted in. Sophia's eyes narrowed. "They'll just drain the air out of this space if you let them." Mrs. Hahn nodded in agreement. "Community is delicate, Liana. It grows like a plant. You can't let people trample the roots." So we made a plan. At the entrance, Claire would greet newcomers and explain the spirit of the day. Everyone works, everyone contributes, everyone respects the space. No exceptions. When Saturday came, the sun was warm, the air sweet with the smell of basil and earth. As I moved between the planting beds, I spotted them, Celeste and Marjorie, approaching in pastel blouses, wearing expressions that could pass for friendly if you didn't look too closely. They made it halfway down the path before Claire intercepted them. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught the important ones. "This is a work-first event. Gloves are in that bin. No, there's no audience seating." Celeste glanced at me, her smile tightening when she realized I wasn't coming over to rescue her from the rules. By the end of the day, they'd planted exactly 3 seedlings between them before leaving early, murmuring something about other commitments. As I rinsed my hands under the garden hose, I felt no guilt, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd drawn a line and held it. This wasn't their space to control. Not anymore. The first sign of their frustration came in the form of a phone call from my grandmother. Sharp, clipped, and timed perfectly to interrupt a quiet evening. "I've been told you embarrassed your aunts," she began without preamble. "They came to support you and you treated them like outsiders." I took a slow breath, reminding myself that this was the same woman who had once excluded me from an entire reunion and called it a misunderstanding. "They were outsiders in that space," I said evenly. "The garden days are for people who contribute, not spectators. Everyone works, everyone shares. That's what makes it a community." Her sigh crackled through the line. "You've always been so rigid, Liana. It's no wonder." She stopped herself, but I already knew where she'd been headed. "No wonder I don't fit the mold?" I offered, my voice calm but steel-edged. "That's the point. I stopped trying to." She shifted tactics. "You're making it difficult for the family to trust you again. People are talking." I almost laughed. "When have you ever trusted me? When I was bending over backwards to please you? When I was letting you set the terms of my life? That wasn't trust. That was control dressed up as tradition." Silence. Then, in a tone meant to cut, she said, "You're going to regret isolating yourself." "Maybe," I replied, "but I'll regret it on my own terms." And I hung up. The call left me wired, pacing my kitchen long after the line went dead. But beneath the sting of her words there was something else, something stronger. For the first time, I realized I wasn't afraid of losing their approval anymore. Because the truth was I'd already lived without it for years. The eruption came sooner than I expected. It was at a local artisan fair, one of those sunny Saturday events where the air smells like roasted almonds and fresh bread. I was browsing a pottery stall when I heard my name, too loud, too sharp to be casual. Celeste. And beside her, Marjorie. They approached like they owned the ground beneath their feet, ignoring the wary glance I gave them. "We need to talk," Celeste said, her voice carrying just enough to make sure the nearby shoppers heard. I stepped aside, not wanting to give them an audience, but they followed. "You've been painting an unfair picture of us," Marjorie accused, her tone brittle. "Telling people we've treated you badly. Making us look toxic." I blinked at her, stunned not by the accusation itself but by the sheer irony. "I haven't had to tell anyone anything," I said. "Your actions speak for themselves." Celeste's eyes narrowed. "You're turning people against the family. Hosting events, building connections, it's like you're replacing us." And there it was out in the open. "This isn't about replacing anyone," I said. "It's about creating something healthy. Something that isn't built on control and conditional love." Marjorie's voice rose. "Conditional love? We've always loved you." I held her gaze. "Then your definition of love is something I don't need." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. People had stopped pretending not to listen. A vendor down the road turned to watch. Celeste's jaw tightened. "You're going to regret this," she said, echoing my grandmother's earlier threat. "Maybe," I replied, turning away. "But I'll regret it while living a life I chose." I walked off without looking back, the murmur of the crowd swallowing whatever parting words they might have tried to throw after me. I'd made it halfway down the row of stalls when a woman caught up to me, lightly touching my arm. "Hey," she said, a little breathless. I couldn't help overhearing, and I just wanted to say good for you. She introduced herself as Marin, a local jewelry maker. "My family's the same," she said, rolling her eyes. "They think if they give you their last name they own your decisions. I walked away 5 years ago. Best thing I ever did." Her words landed like a steadying hand on my spine. I hadn't realized how much I'd been bracing for the usual. People siding with the loudest voices, the most practiced performances of victimhood. Instead, Marin and I found a quiet corner by a coffee cart and talked for nearly an hour. She told me about building her business from a folding table at flea markets, about the cousins who still send her concerned messages like clockwork every holiday, about learning to value peace over approval. "You'll get called selfish," she said, sipping her drink. "Ungrateful. But you'll also get free. And that's worth it." I walked away from that conversation lighter than I'd felt all week. It wasn't just her validation. It was the reminder that what I was doing wasn't isolation. It was connection of a different kind, one chosen instead of assigned. By the time I got home, I'd made a decision. I wasn't just going to keep building my community quietly. I was going to protect it actively, and make sure that anyone who joined understood exactly what it stood for. No guilt. No manipulation. No entry for those who only came to take. This was my family now. And I was finally ready to defend it like one. 2 weeks later, I posted something I'd been drafting in my head for months. A simple photo of the garden in full bloom. Sunlight spilling across the raised beds. Neighbors' hands reaching in to plant and harvest. Caption read, "This space is for those who come with open hands and open hearts. We work together, we share what we grow, and we leave our egos at the gate." It's not about blood, last names, or obligation. It's about choice, respect, and kindness. If you can honor that, you're welcome. If you can't, this isn't your place. I didn't tag anyone. I didn't have to. The message was clear, and within hours the comments began. Friends and neighbors left hearts and words of encouragement. "This is why we love coming here. More communities should be like this." And then, inevitably, the family responses trickled in, veiled barbs dressed as civility. Sounds exclusionary for something you call community. Interesting definition of kindness. Guess some people think they're too good for their roots. I let them sit there. No replies. No deletions. Let the contrast speak for itself. Supportive voices outnumbering the bitter ones 10 to 1. That night, Sophia called me. "You realize you just put the line in the sand where everyone can see it, right?" "Yes," I said. "And I'm not stepping back over it." For years, my boundaries had been whispered, negotiated, softened until they lost their shape. Now they were out in the open, unambiguous. Anyone who came here would know the terms from the start. And for the first time, I felt like the ground under my feet was entirely mine. The last attempt came in the form of a letter. It arrived on thick cream stationery, my name written in my grandmother's careful cursive. For a moment, I considered tossing it straight into the recycling bin, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, her words were polished, deliberate, like she'd drafted them a dozen times before putting pen to paper. "Liana, families go through seasons. We've had ours. Misunderstandings, distance, pride on both sides. I believe it's time to mend fences. Let's not dwell on past mistakes. The family misses you. The children would love to see your beautiful home. Perhaps we could hold a small gathering there, nothing formal, just to start fresh." It was all there. The rewriting of history into something mutual, the glossing over of deliberate choices, the bait of the children to soften me. I set the letter down and stared at it for a long time. A year ago it would have worked. Even 6 months ago, I might have felt the pull to compromise, to prove I wasn't the cold, selfish caricature they painted. Now I saw it for what it was. Another attempt to enter my life without acknowledging the harm they'd caused. Another invitation for me to shrink so they could fit comfortably into my space. I didn't respond right away. I took the letter to the garden, laid it on the compost heap, and pressed it beneath a layer of soil. Some things don't belong in the house you've worked hard to build. Some things are better left to break down and feed something new. And I knew this was one door I wasn't opening again. Spring slipped into summer, and with it came a rhythm I hadn't known my life was missing. Mornings started with the soft scrape of the trowel in soil. Afternoons with neighbors dropping by to share coffee and conversation. Evenings were for long tables under string lights, where the talk drifted easily from books to travel to nothing at all. No tiptoeing around unspoken grudges. No navigating the minefield of someone else's ego. Every so often, a familiar pang would rise. Memories of the lake house, the salty breeze off the water, the way laughter once carried across the dock. But when I followed that thread, it always led to the truth. The warmth I remembered was tied to moments, not people. And I could create moments like that again with the right people. I realized I hadn't checked the family's social media in months. The curiosity that used to itch at me, the fear of missing out, of being erased, had faded into something else entirely. Disinterest. My life felt too full to chase glimpses into theirs. One evening, as fireflies blinked across the garden, Sophia asked, "Do you ever think you'll let them back in?" I thought about it. "Maybe," I said honestly. "If they ever came without strings. If they ever saw me for who I am instead of what I can give." "And if they don't?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "Then I keep living. Because the thing I used to be afraid of, losing them, already happened. And I survived. Better than survived." The truth was, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building, growing. And for the first time, my life wasn't defined by the doors that had closed, but by the ones I'd chosen to open. A year to the day after that knock on my door, I stood in my garden at dusk, barefoot in the cool grass, the scent of jasmine curling through the air. Around me, voices rose in easy laughter. Friends clinking glasses, children chasing each other between the raised beds, the hum of music drifting from an open window. I looked at the long table I'd set beneath the arbor, glowing under strands of warm lights. Every seat was full, but not because anyone felt obligated to be there. They'd come because they wanted to, because this space had become a place where you could show up exactly as you were and still belong. As I poured another round of wine, I thought about the girl I'd been. The one who built her schedule around reunions that left her feeling small, who waited years for an approval that never came. I wanted to reach back through time, take her hand and whisper, "You don't have to earn your place. You can build it." I glanced toward the far corner of the garden, where the compost bin sat quietly, breaking down scraps into something nourishing. Somewhere under those layers was the letter my grandmother had sent, its careful cursive melting into soil. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. From what they'd tried to bury me in, I'd grown something of my own. Something that no amount of guilt or manipulation could uproot. Sophia called my name, waving me over to the table. I took my seat, surrounded by the faces of my chosen family, and felt a peace I'd never known at the lake house or any blood-bound gathering. I'd once thought rejection was the worst wound a family could give. But standing here now, I knew the truth. Sometimes rejection is the gift that hands you back your life.